we have a different geopolitical situation. And we see that, of course, with the whole issue of tariffs and all that. But we see that the world is more and more split in two parts. The West, and even the West starts to be very divided because of these the tariffs and all that. But there's the West and the rest of the world. And all these countries, take Saudi Arabia, for instance, that wants to develop new technologies, new energy solutions and all that, because they know that sooner or later they will not have oil anymore at one point, probably not very soon, but in any case, they have to prepare for that. Who is the leading power when it comes to new technologies and all that? China. Who is the power that tries or that has the ability or even the willingness sometimes to direct your own economy by preventing export or sanctioning and all that? US. And if you see, for instance, the attempts from Trump to force Saudi Arabia to lower its the price of oil so that that could make some pressure on Russia and all that, he received a flat no. Because today, all these countries, they know that they will have more to gain with the Eurasian bloc, let's say, and mainly China, but not only. But also the USSR with Russia, because Russia is also a provider of commodities and all that. So, meaning that they have an alternative. They don't need to have the United States. This idea that US should prevail all the time because they are simply the best, they have the best scientists, the best economists, the best money, the best whatever. This is a little bit a picture of the past. So the tendency today, what you see across the South, the global South, as we can say it, is that they try to escape the dollar. They try to escape the United States, because the United States are in fact are a destabilizing factor in reality. And everybody tries to escape that, meaning that the leverage that the US has on these Middle East leaders. Just let's talk about the Abraham Accords, or these normalization agreement with Israel and all that. In his first mandate, Donald Trump tried to bring Saudi Arabia and others to normalize their relationship with Israel. And they started to draft agreements. In these agreements, the so-called Abraham Accords or agreements, there was no mention of the Palestinian question. But today, Saudi Arabia has said clearly, if there is no Palestinian state, or if the question is not raised or put as a condition of the treaty, we will not normalize our relationship with Israel. And it's very clear. This is very clear. Now, is this idea doable? I don't think so. The outrage that appeared in the media around the world after what Trump said, I think is a signal for the US that it's probably not the right way to go. You know, we have to remember, I'm ready to give some credit to Donald Trump, because at least he's trying to do something, which is something positive compared to what we have seen before. But at the same time, Trump is not very much appreciated in the world. Not even because with the tariff policy that he's applying, and everybody starts to hate Trump now. But also beyond that, I mean, Trump was not very much, nobody liked him as he came in his first presidential term. And today it's probably a little bit better because obviously in the United States, the American population wanted a change and wanted to someone who could improve a situation that was clearly deteriorated during the Biden mandate. So they wanted to have an improvement, and based on that, we can say that at least in the US, the legitimacy of Donald Trump is definitely improved, and probably around the world also. But at the same time, Trump is still Trump. You know, he makes a declaration, and I'm not sure that what he says is always well thought. He's kind of a hip shooter, you know, and that makes him kind of a that let's say he doesn't have a huge of credibility because of that. And Trump is starting to understand also. I made the comparison with the Ukrainian issue, and I think on both theaters, uh, Trump and his team starts to understand that situations are a little bit more complex than what they figured out before, and therefore they need to deepen a little bit make a little bit more homework to come up with practicable solutions to solve the problem. And for that reason, when it comes up with project or ideas such as the one he proposed for Gaza, I think it's not credible for most people. And I think he understands that. And for me, this plan is probably something that will remain in the air, because obviously Netanyahu has understood that this is an option that would fit perfectly in his views. So we can admit that Netanyahu will continue with this idea, but I'm not sure the Americans will. Again, I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball, but I think this is leading nowhere. And we need to see. You remember, for Ukraine, he wanted to stop the conflict within 24 hours, and then it was like 100 days, and now everybody understands that it's probably not even 100 days. Anyway, so what I mean is that the Trump team needs to mature. And they're probably brilliant people with good ideas, and at least they are less willing to engage into kind of perpetual, permanent wars around the globe and things like this, which is, I think, a positive thing. But to solve the problem, since they engage, I think they still need to do some homework to understand better the situation, to understand better what is at stake for both parties, not just one, and to get out of those thick narrative that we had in the West, to trying to figure out the situations with very simplistic views, that you have the bad Hamas and the bad Russians and the good Ukrainians and the good Israelis and all that. And we see that all that is collapsing because this narrative is not in tune with reality. And therefore, there is a lot of work to be done by the Trump administration to get on the top of that. So, when you see that from far, we'd say, well, the West is no longer the West. There is, within the West, there is a relationship between powers which is based on who is the more powerful. It's a power struggle within the Western Bloc itself. So how can you trust these people? They have crumbling economies. They have crumbling political systems. All these countries, France, Germany, UK, Italy, even the US to some extent, have budgetary problems. They are not even able to manage their own countries, and they want to manage other countries. How can you trust such country? Meaning that uh, it's not to say that US has no capability of leverage. US has still an influence. I mean, the dollar, even if we talk about de-dollarization and all that, the dollar remains so far the most used currency when it comes to trade, international trade, and all that. So that and that will stay that way for a while now. But the trend is is changing direction, and everybody understands that. And everybody understands that the future belongs to Asia, and therefore it's probably at this stage it's a good idea to shift slowly towards the West. And we see that the West, first of all, the West, I mentioned before that the world is split between the West and the rest of the world. But it's not exactly true, because if you look at the West is split today. There is no common position about Palestine, about Ukraine, about NATO. Now you have the EU wanting to create its own small NATO somehow because they don't trust NATO, because in NATO you have the US and they don't trust the US. And the US is put tariffs on all these friends. Canada is a NATO ally, and others, Germany and Japan and all that. Which, of course, Japan is not part of NATO, but the US is putting tariffs and punishing, in essence, their own allies. And the ability, for instance, of the West of supporting Ukraine, even supporting Israel, because at the end they provided bombs, okay, but they didn't provide any solution to solve the situation. They are not problem solvers. The West do not solve problems. They create problems. They generate problems. They have brought the Middle East into chaos in Iraq, in Syria, everywhere. They never came up with a solution. So when you see that from the Middle East, what kind of picture do you have? You have a picture of countries that are bragging around that they are the best and all that, but beyond this, nothing concrete come out of this. No, when we talk about, again, I repeat myself, but when you talk about both Ukraine and Palestine, where are the Europeans? This fantastic European Union with all its values, its economic power and all that, where are they? They are totally absent from the diplomatic scene. They are totally absent from any solution, both in Ukraine and in Palestine. So what kind of credibility do you have? The West has, in the last 30 years or so, the West has not demonstrated any ability to be constructive. We have been destructive. We have destroyed everything, but we haven't built anything. And that's obvious with Ukraine. And Ukrainians themselves understand that. And it becomes almost like a joke to some extent, because Ukrainians start to realize that they have been framed by the Europeans and the US. That everything that was promised was in fact could not be kept. You know, the US and the Europeans said they would help Ukraine as long as it takes. And now they say as long as we can. And we see that the West has no longer the military capabilities, the industrial capabilities, the financial capabilities, the budgetary capabilities to support Ukraine as they promised. And that's the kind of problem. And you have more and more that's the reason why China has gained so much, let's say, credibility in Africa because China has understood that if it wants to improve trade with Africa, let's say, that applies to other continents as well, but let's talk about Africa because that's a continent I know. And I lived in two countries that used to be, at that time, the most important presence of China on the African continent, namely Sudan and Kenya. And therefore, I think Trump is a little bit too optimistic when he thinks that he has still a lot of leverage. They still have some leverage. It's not that they don't have any, but they might be. Now you have Iran and Saudi Arabia that basically have good relations. The Iran has received the fighters from Russia. At the end of the day, probably fighters, I mean, those aircraft coming from China or from Russia are probably more reliable, less expensive, and probably less subjected to political variation and decision that you have in Washington. So this leverage is reducing at very high speed, and again, I don't know, and again, that doesn't mean that there is absolutely no leverage from that Trump can use, but I would say that people don't trust him. All the declaration he made about Gaza and that doesn't engage countries to consider Trump as a credible partner. That's my personal view. And therefore, if you have a weapon like the F-35, for instance, you'd better to be an ally of the US because otherwise they can just prevent you to use your own aircraft. I remember when I was in NATO, I met a guy who was a test pilot for it was a Dutch test pilot of the F-35, and he told us, he said, well, if the US wants us to stop using the aircraft, they were just to turn a button and that's it. You cannot use them. So meaning that when you know that, and the same applies to Patriot missiles, THAAD systems, and all that, when you buy your weapons in the US, what is the guarantee you have that you can use these weapons in case of a conflict against Israel, for instance? And I'm not even talking about the quality of technology, which today, when it comes to armament, probably today is probably not in every respect, but in many respects, the balance of quality in terms of armaments is probably in favor of Russia, probably China as well. China is the biggest consumer market in the world and the biggest producer as well. So they will find customers, and they will find also suppliers. So this is not a problem, and all that is a dry loss for the U.S. because their grain is more expensive than the one you could get in Brazil or somewhere else, and that's exactly what happened with farm products with China. I mean, as soon as the Americans started to threaten with tariffs and all that, the Chinese said, "Okay, no problem. Do your tariff. We just stop trading with you, and we have other partners." But when the Chinese have understood that if they want to improve trade relations with Africa, they have first to develop the infrastructures, and therefore the first step is to invest in infrastructure in Africa, to create and build railroads, roads, highways, ports, infrastructure to handle the containers and things like this. And then once you have that, then you have create a prerequisite to have a better trade relations, because all infrastructure are ready for that. And the West has never done that, at least not recently. They did that probably in the 19th century. I mean, France, probably Britain to some extent, in Asia a little bit, and so they tried to do so, to create some infrastructures, to create that in order to improve trade. But since Second World War, the West has not done that anymore. They have probably had to build a factory somewhere, but that's it. They didn't work to improve the road networks or railroads or communication networks and things like this. This is the reason why the Africans appreciate the Chinese, because everything goes step by step, but they move surely into a kind of a win-win situation. It's not just exploitation of a market as the Western powers did. It's also about creating the market first, and then using the market to have trade. And that's, you see that with the Chinese. I mean, last year the Chinese have canceled 500,000 tons of wheat from the US, and instead they buy this in Brazil, in Africa, and somewhere else. So that means that the loss, again, it's a zero-sum game. What you lose on one side, it's a gain for somebody else. As a result, we see this slow shift of let's say, influence that goes in the direction of China and Asia at large. The fact of the matter is that Russia is in a position of force in Ukraine, doesn't need to have a pause in the conflict. On the contrary, they would prefer to use the current dynamics that you have on a battlefield. And therefore, the idea of freezing the conflict, besides the fact that it's something that the Russians have discarded right away, because they have said, well, we don't want to come back in the same situation as the Minsk agreement, in which people decided to go into this agreement for the simple reason that they wanted to rearm and prepare their forces for further action. So, in fact, it was a pause just in order to rearm. It was not in good faith. Therefore, the Russians have said, well, we were fooled once, but we will not get fooled twice. And therefore, there is no way that we will accept a freezing of the situation. They don't need that. They are moving ahead. Therefore, there is no need for them to have a pause. And that's it. I think it's exactly the same thing as what we have said for Palestine, that the Trump team, including Keith Kellogg, who is the special envoy for Ukraine, I think they had a very simplistic understanding of the situation in Ukraine. They didn't understand what is exactly at stake for both Russia and Ukraine. As a result, they came up with a very simplistic view on what can be done and what can be achieved with this idea of freezing. Of course, if you depart from the idea that Russia is suffering from the conflict more than Ukraine, then you would say they will welcome if we have a freeze of the situation on the front line. But the problem is that it's exactly not what the situation is. So that shows that the Trump team came into in office 2 weeks ago with a very simplified understanding of the situation, and now they are discovering that the situation is a bit more complex. And the situation has been even more complex because uh, precisely all the tariffs and all that have triggered response from China. And China has banned the export of some very rare minerals, like the gallium, germanium. There are some others, and even tungsten, I think, has also a ban or restriction on delivering. Meaning that U.S. has understood that by using tariffs and having response from the China in particular, that I'm not sure they even expected that. That's very strange. They thought they would apply tariffs and sanctions without any response, and I think that's exactly we the same problem with Palestine. That I think Trump is overestimating the power of the U.S. and the position of the US in the world. And if you look at who has the most reserves and the most production of tungsten and germanium and things like this, it's China. And US is depending on China for its supply of critical minerals that are used to produce semiconductors, which are considered as critical for the U.S. In any case, what happened is that the U.S. has now a problem with its supply chain when it comes to semiconductor and critical minerals, and that's the reason why Zelensky picked up the problem and said, well, because the whole issue in Ukraine, as we have mentioned on the channel a couple of times, I mean, again, Trump is not a pacifist, but he has understood that funding a war doesn't, but he understood that the war in Ukraine is just a black hole. And therefore, you pour money into that and you have nothing in return. So initially, my understanding, and I think the understanding of Zelensky, is that you are not willing to provide additional support. Well, we give you an incentive, you provide additional support, and we give you access to rare earth and minerals. And for Zelensky, he said, well, that's probably the reason why he doesn't want to provide additional weapons. And therefore, we need to create an incentive for Trump to provide support, both financial and military support. And this incentive was, we'll exchange your support against minerals, access to minerals. But there are two problems. The first is that, again, I don't know what, and again, it's a little bit like Gaza, because Trump changed his mind very quickly. Again, it's a hip shooter. And that's probably how initially Trump understood it. And therefore, this is the whole aspect of this conflict on the Western side. We tend to understand the conflict based on a narrative instead of trying to understanding based on the reality of on the ground. And that's exactly what the Trump team is discovering at this stage. And they are discovering a situation which is very far away from what you can extract from the media and all that. And the fact of the matter is that if you come to the point that you will have to negotiate with the Russians, you have to negotiate based on the reality, not based on a fantasy. And that's exactly where you see the real obstacle to a solution. Although I expected the Trump administration to come up with feasible solutions, probably not in 24 hours, but let's say until the end of the year, for instance. But now I tend to be more pessimistic on that aspect, and I feel that the Keith Kellogg and others are not prepared to understand to bring up solutions that can be acceptable for the Russians. And there is no way you can bypass the acceptance of the Russians because they are winning on the ground. They are winning on the ground. The reason why Vladimir Putin wants to keep the four regions, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Lugansk, is precisely because of the objective he set at the beginning of the offensive, to protect the population. Because we know that if, let's say, the Russians would withdraw from these republics, you would have revenge action on the local population, on all those who somehow lived with the Russians or accepted the Russians or even cooperated with the Russians. And you would return to such a situation where the Ukrainians would revenge. So there is no way the Russians want that. And for that reason, you can just forget the idea that these four regions would be returned to Ukraine at one point. Probably there might be discussions on other territories, but on those ones, you will not have any discussion because the objective of the operation, the military operation, was to protect the Russian population in Ukraine. And therefore, the only possibility today is to keep them under the full protection of Russia. And there are some aspects that you cannot, when you talk about the return of those oblasts. I mean, today it's no longer so much a team, but anyway, the idea that you could return those territory to Ukraine in 20 years or something like that, this is a fantasy. And therefore, so you that's the reality on the ground. The fact that nobody wanted to acknowledge that the minority, the fact that the West didn't want to acknowledge that, has in fact created a situation where Russia was obliged to intervene. So again, by refusing the reality, by refusing to accept simple real facts on the ground and replacing them by a narrative, we just created a situation that today is in disadvantage for Ukraine. And that will continue that way because the West has not understood that. And therefore, we continue to live on a narrative rather than on the reality of the ground. So first, before giving access to Trump, you have first to sort out whether you can even access this, legally, by talking to the real owner of that, which is probably you can solve this issue. But there's another issue that you cannot really solve. So what can you give to Trump? So we are in this kind of situation in which, and that's something which is key to understand, I think, the way both Ukrainians and Russians conduct the conflict. For the Ukrainians, Zelensky in particular, the narrative is the key aspect of the conflict. The way it has, everything is in the way he sells the conflict to the West. And we have here a real example of this, the gap you have between the narrative and the reality. And that's where you can ask yourself how realistic and how sane or insane are the leaders, both in Ukraine and in the West at large, because it's very fine to say, and everybody talks about this kind of exchange minerals against support or things like this. But does Ukraine have full control over these minerals? And if yes, for how long? But again, Trump doesn't want to get involved in this conflict anymore. And now the narrative of Trump has changed. He said, well, we agree to have the minerals, but not to provide additional support. I think Zelensky, to some extent, has been framed by Trump with that. By giving this proposal, he gave Trump an opportunity to say, oh, okay, I take the minerals, but not for additional thing, but to pay what we have already delivered, which is a radical change. That's the first point. A second point is that when Zelensky said we give access to rare earths and things like this, well, it has to take into account about who owns these minerals, because in fact, the ground where those minerals are belong to individuals. It's not just land that belongs to God. It belongs to some oligarchs, in particular the oligarchs that is owning Burisma. Burisma is the company in which the son of Joe Biden used to be part of the staff, meaning that these earths, they belong to someone.